question is from Reverend James Bhagwan from the Pacific Conference of Churches. Over to you, Reverend.
Thank you so much for your reflections earlier. In the context of the 2050 strategy and the high prevalence of gender-based violence in our region, including Aotearoa New Zealand and the land now called Australia, what commitments and shifts do we need to see when looking at the review of the Pacific Leaders Gender Equality Declaration and the collaboration between governments, crop agencies, development partners, but most importantly, civil society and faith-based organizations who work on the ground? And noting that it's not about two or four, but with, as we heard earlier. And how do we also ensure that being socially inclusive doesn't mean that we're being generally inclusive without recognizing specific needs and issues from a cross-cutting perspective? Thank you.
Thank you for asking that. And I was reflecting as you were asking, Reverend, that you probably could answer it better than the people on the stage, right? So gender-based violence is we see in every society, in every country, and it is tragic, it is costly, it's hurtful, and it means that there are too many, particularly women and girls, who are unable to fulfil their potential. So there's an individual human cost to that. And then there's a broader social cost and an economic cost. And I think your question was something like, you know, how do we change that? And you know, we had a particularly high-profile murder of a wife and a mother and her children by a former partner, and we had a vigil outside of Parliament House, and the sun was going down, and I remember thinking at the time, I'm 50, just over 50. I thought, I've been going to vigils like this for 30 years. So I think the first step is acknowledging, certainly in Australia, and I suspect in many societies, its existence and its prevalence, and it's it's not confined to one group, one economic class, one culture, and to really confront it, I think requires such engagement and collaboration between different parts of society. So there is the rule of law, which, and I agree with the Prime Minister that you have to have that as a baseline. But as you know, and I commend the work that you and others do within the churches, you have to reinforce that norm, that principle, through a whole range of different parts of civil society. Because leadership is, there are so many ways in which leadership is shown in the community. Elected leaders, religious leaders, community leaders, sports leaders. So I don't pretend to have all the answers on this. I think it is good that we talk about it in the ways that we do now. It is good that we've had gender equality declarations. It's good that it'd be good if leaders remain seized of it. It's really important it's in the 2050 strategy. All of those things are steps forward. But I suppose my observation would be, and what I'd be interested in talking about in the months and years to come, is how you actually work as between government and civil society in order to change our standards of behaviour. Because, the standards of behaviour we expect of ourselves are in part legally regulated, but they're also ethically regulated and spiritually and normatively by the communities in which we live and culturally. So all of those frameworks need to be utilised if we actually get serious about addressing it. And, you know, I think we have to be. We don't want this happening to our sisters and our daughters. We don't want the cost in human terms and economic terms and social terms. But anyway, thank you for the question. It's very important.
To now invite another Pacific leader to join us on the podium, Reverend James Bhagwan. Padre, I can't see you, but there you are. And, you know, just to take a few moments, Padre, if you don't mind, to reflect back what you've heard in this Talanoa, maybe share some key insights and to offer a summation of this discussion. So thank you very much for that and for being so patient with us.
Thank you, Audrey. And you put me at a pulpit. I will not preach for 3 hours, don't worry. I looked at that picture and I heard so much about age and men. I'm glad I shaved today. And even though I'm a mature minister, I'm still seen as the young boy in the church when I meet the older ministers. So I'm the carry boy. But if we reflect on what we've heard today, and I want to start right at the beginning because we began with the leadership of Indigenous people. That wasn't just an item that was performed. That was Indigenous people speaking the language of Indigenous people in dance, through culture. And we have to recognize that as Pacific people, we don't just speak one language. We speak the language, yes, of policy, we speak political language, but we speak the language of culture, the language of spirituality, the language of tradition, which is what guides us. And today we have had, in the reflections that we've heard, different aspects of that language spoken. What we've also heard is the role that activism plays in shaping our leaders, particularly our young activists, many whom sit on the stage began as young activists, as we heard. And I am reminded from my YWCA connections that the Honourable Prime Minister of Samoa was also a young women YWCA World Member, Council member at one stage as well. So there are many different ways in which our young people can get involved in leadership. I also want to acknowledge that when we talk about leadership, and perhaps I'm not the right person to talk about women in leadership, although I come from a feminist family, I acknowledge a look that our two women prime ministers gave each other when that was mentioned by Audrey. But in that look, another language, a non-verbal language, and I just saw, and that communicated so much about the shared challenges and the shared journeys that they must have gone through, and they reflected on that as they shared their stories today. But in the context of who we are as Pacific people, the reminder that regionalism is part of our identity. We are community, we are Pacific family. It is not an either or, it is an and, both local and regional. The role of traditional leadership, the role of our culture and our values as responsibilities, as custodians that we need to manage, as guardians of our Blue Pacific. As someone who works predominantly these days with civil society, I want to acknowledge that we have so many women in our civil society leadership today. And I wish and I pray that that translates, as we've heard, into the political sphere, because our leaders are being nurtured there. And maybe they will have that opportunity to come forward. The Pacific churches this year had as our representatives to the first member state parties of the TPNW in Vienna and the Oceans Conference were not represented by the old padres, but by two young women, young mothers, taking the stories of their Pacific to go and advocate. Of course, they were accompanied by a slightly older archbishop, but they worked together. So the intergenerational aspect of leadership is also very important. And our plea to our leaders, of those who have faced the challenge, both in terms of being women leaders, but also young leaders coming through, is to mentor the future leaders of our Pacific, to make that space open and invite them to come forward. The question of leadership and regionalism as you prepare, dear leaders, for your retreat tomorrow is something that we have been reflecting on, and how I wish that this Talanoa was the dialogue we had with civil society and private sector earlier today. But you mentioned some really important things about being anchored, about being rooted. And I would like to conclude this reflection by sharing something that our civil society groups reflected on: leadership, on what it means to be Pacific, what it means to be part of the family. And it is a covenant that they put together, and it begins with two words: we are. We are because we have been. We are because we are to be. In solidarity we come. We in turn renew our commitment to build solidarity, recognizing the preponderance of reasons that unite us, and that our weaves are made stronger by the weave of the other. In solidarity, we come as Pacific people who are custodians of nature, anchored by our faith and our spirituality. Yet we come as we are because together we hold a vital responsibility. The mantle has been passed on to us by our ancestors from their hands into our hands. If you are interested, I can share you that covenant later. But that is just the introduction to a covenant that civil society have pledged to work together. And it is our hope and our dream that not only with the 2050 strategy, but as you meet tomorrow to discuss and reflect on the future of our regionalism, that it is something that you come out saying, we are. May God bless you all. Naka.
Vinaka Vakalevu, Padre, for really that very thoughtful and deep reflection, and for capturing so many of those important insights and moments. I thank you very much.